A maid who had spent years trying to rebuild her life after a personal tragedy takes a quiet housekeeping job in a wealthy billionaire's mansion, not expecting anything unusual. Until one day, while cleaning a room she'd already passed 100 times before, she discovers an old photograph hidden behind a piece of furniture that stops her in her tracks. A photo of a child who looks exactly like the daughter she lost in a fire 2 decades ago. And what the billionaire's young son unexpectedly tells her right after will change everything she thought she knew about her past. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. In 1998, Grace Thompson lived in a small, modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. She was a single mother doing her best to raise her baby girl, Amelia, who had just turned 1 year old. Grace had a simple life, filled with quiet routines. She worked at a diner nearby during the day and spent her evenings caring for Amelia. Their home was small, just 2 rooms, but it was filled with warmth and love. On one rainy night, Grace was putting Amelia to bed when she noticed the smell of smoke. At first, she thought it was from outside, but soon she realized the fire had started inside the house. Within moments, the flames grew quickly, feeding on the old wood and dry furniture. Grace grabbed a wet towel and rushed to Amelia's crib, trying to protect her. But the fire spread too fast. The smoke was thick, making it hard to breathe. She tried again to reach the baby, but the heat forced her back. Screaming for help, Grace ran outside to get the neighbors' attention. Someone had already called the fire department, but the fire was out of control. Rain fell heavily, but it wasn't enough to stop the fire. Flames burst through the windows as Grace stood outside, begging the firefighters to save her daughter. When they finally managed to put the fire out, the house had completely collapsed. The firefighters searched through the wreckage, but found no sign of Amelia's body. Everything had turned to ash. Grace was devastated. She couldn't understand how everything had happened so fast. She kept asking where her baby was, but no one had an answer. The fire report stated it had been an accidental electrical fire. With no remains found, they could not confirm the child's death. But there was no evidence of survival either. For the authorities, the case was closed. For Grace, it was the start of a life filled with unanswered questions. After the fire, Grace's life completely fell apart. With no family to turn to and no home left, she spent her days moving from one hospital to another. The trauma of that night stayed with her. She couldn't sleep without seeing the fire in her dreams or hearing Amelia cry. Doctors diagnosed her with severe emotional distress and recommended psychiatric care. For a long time, she lived in shelters and medical facilities. Her days became long and empty, filled with silence and pain. People stopped visiting, and no one remembered her story after a few years. She was just another woman who had lost everything. Grace never stopped thinking about Amelia. Deep inside, a small part of her refused to believe her daughter had died. But she had no proof, no hope, and nowhere to look. She held on to a few burned pictures and the last baby toy that survived the fire. These were the only pieces left of the life she once had with her daughter. At the same time, in another part of Atlanta, Richard Anderson and his wife Margaret were facing struggles of their own. Richard was a successful businessman who had built a strong company from the ground up. Margaret had always wanted to be a mother, but after many years of trying and several failed pregnancies, the couple decided to adopt. They worked with a well-known adoption agency that had a reputation for handling everything legally and professionally. After a few months of paperwork and waiting, the agency informed them about a baby girl available for adoption. The child had no known family and had been found in difficult circumstances. Richard and Margaret didn't ask too many questions. They were overwhelmed with joy at the chance to become parents. They named the baby Sophie and took her home, ready to give her a safe and happy life. For them, it was a dream finally coming true, and they had no idea of the tragedy that came before. Sophie quickly became the center of Richard and Margaret's lives. They gave her everything she needed: love, care, attention, and stability. Margaret stopped working to stay home full-time, making sure Sophie had all the support a growing child needed. The couple often looked at Sophie with wonder, amazed at how lucky they were to have found her. Sophie was a quiet baby at first, but as she grew, she developed a kind and curious personality. She loved stories and music and enjoyed being around other children. Richard and Margaret never told her she was adopted. They felt she was theirs in every way that mattered. The adoption papers were sealed, and the agency had told them the baby had been abandoned, so they believed there was no one else in the world who would come looking. Life for the Andersons was peaceful, built on the belief that Sophie had come to them by fate. They were unaware that another woman still grieved for that same child. Years passed, and Grace continued to live in the shadows of her past. She remained in the system, going from one care facility to another. She spoke less and less about the fire, and many people thought she had finally accepted what had happened, but she had not. Every year on the same date, she would sit alone, looking at the sky, remembering the night that took her daughter. Her hands trembled as she held the scorched baby toy, still believing somehow that Amelia might still be alive. She never stopped hoping, even though everything told her it was impossible. Grace had no way of knowing what had really happened that night. She didn't know that someone had found her baby before the fire destroyed the house completely, or that the baby had ended up in an adoption agency. The truth was buried under reports, lost paperwork, and time. All she had was her memory, her grief, and a question that would never leave her: what really happened to Amelia? Meanwhile, the Anderson family went on with their lives, still unaware of the real story behind their adopted daughter. Sophie, now a young girl, showed no signs that her past was different from what she had been told. She loved her parents, and they loved her. There was no reason for them to think their life was built on someone else's pain. Grace and the Andersons never crossed paths, their lives moving in different directions, linked only by the events of one rainy night. The truth stayed hidden, locked away in closed files and forgotten memories. No one suspected that Sophie was actually Amelia, the baby believed to have died in the fire, and so life continued. Grace remained alone with her loss, and Richard and Margaret raised their daughter with joy. That one night had changed everything for both families, but in completely opposite ways. What started with a fire ended with silence, and from that silence, a new life began. 2 decades had passed since the fire that destroyed Grace Thompson's life. She was older now, her face marked by the years and the pain she had endured. But after spending so many years in hospitals, shelters, and temporary jobs, she finally found some peace. Grace had managed to rent a small apartment with the help of a local church group and was doing her best to live day by day. When she heard about a job opening for a housekeeper in a large mansion outside Atlanta, she applied right away. She didn't expect much, but hoped for a stable job that could help her get back on her feet. When the call came saying she had been hired, she felt relieved. The house was a huge, recently renovated property surrounded by tall trees and long fences. Grace arrived early on her first day, dressed in clean clothes and carrying a simple bag with a few personal items. She had no idea that working there would change the course of her life again. The mansion belonged to a man named Richard Anderson, a widower who lived alone with his 6-year-old son, Ethan. Richard was rarely home, always busy with work, and the staff barely saw him except for brief instructions. Grace didn't ask questions. She was there to clean, not to get involved in the family's personal matters. But during the introduction, she learned from the head housekeeper, Mrs. Cole, that the boy had been diagnosed with autism. Mrs. Cole, an older woman who had worked in the house for many years, met Grace at the door. She gave her a quick tour of the place but kept a cold attitude the entire time. "You're just another worker," she said, without hiding her judgment. Grace nodded and stayed quiet. She wasn't there to make friends. She needed this job. That same morning, she started cleaning the main hallway, working slowly and carefully. Every detail mattered to her. It was more than a job. It was a chance to rebuild her life one step at a time. The house was huge, with high ceilings, expensive furniture, and long, quiet hallways. Each room looked like it had been decorated by professionals, but despite the beauty, the place felt empty. There were very few signs of a child living there. Grace didn't see any toys scattered around or drawings on the walls. It was all too perfect, too quiet. As she cleaned, she thought about how different this house was from the small, warm home she once had with her daughter. Still, she stayed focused, cleaning the windows, dusting the furniture, and making sure nothing was out of place. She followed the schedule given to her by Mrs. Cole and didn't complain. Whenever they crossed paths, Mrs. Cole kept her distance, only speaking to give instructions or point out something Grace had missed. Grace accepted the coldness without reaction. She was used to being treated like she didn't matter. But every time she finished a task, she felt a small sense of pride. She was working, earning, and slowly regaining control. As the days passed, Grace began to notice things about the house and its people. Richard was barely seen, often leaving early and coming home late. When he did appear, he looked tired and distracted. He never spoke to Grace directly, and she respected his space. Ethan, the little boy, was quiet. Grace only saw him a few times during her cleaning hours. He didn't speak much, and often stayed in his room or in the garden with a therapist or a caregiver. He seemed to live in his own world, and Grace didn't try to force any connection. Still, something about the boy made her feel a strange mix of sadness and curiosity. There was something familiar in his expression, though she couldn't explain it. She began to take extra care when cleaning near his space, making sure his toys were neatly arranged and his blankets were folded properly. She didn't do this because anyone told her to. She did it because, for the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose. Mrs. Cole continued to watch her closely. She didn't like Grace and made no effort to hide it. She would inspect her work, point out minor mistakes, and often remind her of her place. But Grace remained calm. She had faced worse in life. A few rude words or cold glances couldn't shake her. She focused on doing her job well and avoided unnecessary conversations. One afternoon, while cleaning a hallway closet, Grace found an old box filled with photographs and papers. She didn't open it, just moved it carefully and put it back where it was. But the moment stayed in her mind. The house felt like it had stories hiding in every corner. She didn't want to pry, but she also couldn't help feeling that there was more to this place than she was being told. Despite the cold atmosphere and the silence, Grace felt something pulling her closer to this house and its people. Something she couldn't quite understand yet. But she kept working, step by step, with quiet determination. Grace didn't know how much her life was about to change again. For her, this job was a way to survive. She had no idea that the man who owned the house was the same Richard Anderson who had adopted her daughter years ago. She had no clue that Ethan's late mother was Margaret, the woman who had raised her child. And she certainly didn't imagine that the past, buried under years of pain and silence, was about to resurface. Grace continued her days with discipline and care. She cleaned each room as if trying to bring order to her own past. The mansion stood still, watching, as Grace moved through it like a shadow, unaware that she had stepped into the center of a story that had begun long ago. What seemed like just another job was slowly becoming a path back to the life she had lost. Without realizing it, Grace was not only returning to work, but returning to a life she had thought was gone forever. Ethan, the son of billionaire Richard Anderson, was a quiet and distant child. He rarely spoke and often avoided everyone in the house, including the staff. At only 6 years old, he already had a routine that kept him separate from others. He would spend hours alone in his room or outside in a specific part of the garden, away from the windows and people. He didn't like loud sounds, didn't respond when people called his name, and never made eye contact. Most of the staff had given up trying to interact with him. They were instructed to respect his space and leave him alone unless it was necessary. Ethan didn't cry or scream. He didn't cause problems. He just existed in silence. Grace, who had recently started working in the house, noticed this from the beginning. She watched him quietly from a distance, never pushing or getting too close. She saw how he walked slowly, always looking at the ground, and how he avoided any interaction with others. At first, Grace simply did her work and followed the rules. But each day, she noticed Ethan hiding in the corners, watching her clean. He didn't speak or move toward her, but he never seemed afraid of her. This made her curious. She started humming softly while she worked. Not songs with words, just simple melodies. She didn't plan it. It was something she had always done to comfort herself. One day, she noticed Ethan staying longer in the same room while she was humming. The next day, he sat on the floor near the couch as she cleaned nearby, still silent, but closer than before. Grace didn't say anything. She just kept working, acting as if everything was normal. She made sure not to look at him directly or speak suddenly. Over the next few days, this small routine repeated. Ethan would appear, sit quietly while she cleaned, and then disappear again. It wasn't much, but to Grace it felt like the beginning of something important. One morning, as she was dusting the living room, Grace noticed Ethan watching her from behind the door. She pretended not to see him and continued humming. Then she slowly took a clean, colorful cloth from her cleaning bag and placed it on the floor a few feet from where he stood. It wasn't a toy, just a simple square of bright fabric, but something about it caught Ethan's attention. He waited a moment, then slowly walked toward it, picked it up, and held it in his hands. Grace didn't say a word. She kept cleaning the shelves, pretending not to notice. After a while, Ethan sat on the floor and began folding the cloth over and over. His expression was calm. Grace smiled to herself, but didn't react. That was the first time she had seen him touch something willingly while someone else was in the room. From that day on, she started bringing different cloths or small objects, placing them gently nearby, and watching as Ethan slowly grew more curious. Ethan's behavior started to change slightly. He began appearing more often when Grace was working in the common areas. Sometimes he would copy her movements, picking up a cloth and wiping a table just like she did. Other times, he would sit quietly and watch her for long periods. Grace never rushed him, never asked questions, and never tried to force a conversation. She understood that patience was key. She spoke to him sometimes, using a soft voice, describing what she was doing or telling him what color a cloth was. He never answered, but she could tell he was listening. One day, as she cleaned the windows, she heard a soft sound behind her. She turned slowly and saw Ethan smiling, holding one of the cloths tightly in his hands. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. Grace's heart felt heavy and light at the same time. It was the first smile she had seen from him since she started working in the house. It gave her hope. Richard Anderson had noticed the small changes in his son. He didn't say anything at first, choosing to watch from a distance. He had spent years trying to help Ethan through therapy, education programs, and special care, but nothing had made much of a difference. Seeing his son slowly open up, even in small ways, caught his attention. He started asking Mrs. Cole about Grace's routine. The housekeeper, still not fond of Grace, reported the changes in Ethan but dismissed them as coincidence. But Richard didn't agree. He started observing more closely and realized that whenever Grace was around, Ethan seemed calmer and more focused. He saw the way the boy would sit near her, how he reacted to her singing, and how he smiled while holding the cloth she gave him. These small things might not seem important to others, but to Richard, they were huge. He didn't interrupt or get involved yet. He just watched, feeling a mixture of surprise, confusion, and cautious hope. The bond between Grace and Ethan continued to grow without words. It wasn't built on conversations or lessons. It was something quieter and deeper, made of presence, trust, and understanding. Grace didn't treat Ethan like he was broken or strange. She didn't expect him to behave like other children. She simply accepted him as he was. And somehow, that made all the difference. Ethan began showing more reactions, small hand movements, repeated gestures, and sometimes soft sounds. Grace responded with the same calm and gentle behavior. Over time, even Mrs. Cole began to notice the difference, though she didn't say much. Richard kept watching, unsure of what this new connection meant, but deeply grateful for it. For the first time in a long while, Ethan was not just a boy hiding in silence. He was beginning to reach out, even if only in small ways. And it all started with Grace, a woman carrying her own pain, who managed to see the quiet world that Ethan lived in and gently walked into it. Grace and Ethan were spending more and more time together. Their bond had become stronger over the weeks. What started with silence and small gestures had turned into something deeper. Ethan, who once avoided eye contact and stayed hidden, was now more present. He began to make sounds more often and was slowly trying to speak. Grace was patient. She never forced him to say anything, but always encouraged him gently. One day, while she was folding laundry in the hallway, Ethan came close and softly said, "Gray." At first, she didn't understand, but then he pointed at her and repeated, "Gray." She realized he was trying to say her name, Grace. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled and nodded, saying, "Yes, that's me." After that, Ethan began using a few more short words. He would say, "Yes," "No," and sometimes repeat names of colors. He stayed near Grace most of the time. Even the staff, including Mrs. Cole, started to notice how much he had changed. One afternoon, it started to rain and the sky turned dark. Grace and Ethan were inside the playroom. She had finished cleaning early and was watching him draw on the floor with colored chalk. He liked doing that, drawing shapes, lines, and sometimes simple objects. Grace handed him a few pieces of chalk and sat nearby without interrupting him. She watched as Ethan drew a woman with a long dress, holding a baby in her arms. He wasn't usually this focused, but today he kept adding details to the figure. When he finished, he looked up at Grace and said clearly, "She came from the fire." The sentence came out slowly, but each word was understandable. Grace froze. Her heart started beating faster. She looked at the drawing again, then back at Ethan. "Who came from the fire?" she asked in a calm voice, even though her hands were shaking. Ethan didn't respond. He stared at the drawing for a few more seconds, then turned away and began playing with another toy. Grace couldn't stop thinking about what he said. It stayed in her mind the entire evening. The words, "She came from the fire," kept repeating like an echo. She didn't know what Ethan meant, but it touched something deep inside her. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, she went back to her cleaning routine. She had been assigned to organize Richard's office. It was a large room filled with bookshelves, boxes, and drawers. While dusting one of the shelves, she found a photo album tucked between two books. Curious, she opened it carefully. The first pages had pictures of Richard and his late wife, Margaret. There were wedding photos, vacations, and images from parties. As she turned the pages, she noticed a section with pictures of a young girl. The girl looked about 5 or 6 years old in the photos. She was black, with bright eyes and curly hair. Her name, written in pen under the photos, was Sophie. Something about the girl's face felt familiar. She had seen thousands of faces in her life, but this one made her feel strange, like she was looking at a memory she couldn't place. Her hands trembled as she touched the photo. The girl's smile, the shape of her eyes, even the way her hair curled, it all brought back something Grace couldn't explain. She sat down on the edge of the desk, holding the album open. Her thoughts were spinning. Sophie was Richard's adopted daughter, now studying abroad, according to Mrs. Cole. Grace had never met her, but the face in the photo stayed in her mind like a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. She kept looking, page after page, trying to find more pictures. Each one made the same feeling grow stronger. Grace felt a chill run through her body, though the room was warm and silent. She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself it was just a coincidence. Maybe Sophie just looked like someone she once knew. But the sense of déjà vu didn't leave. Grace stayed in the office for a while longer, pretending to finish her cleaning, but her eyes kept going back to the album. The phrase Ethan had said earlier, "She came from the fire," kept coming back into her head. The timing felt strange. First, that unexpected drawing. Then the photo of a girl who somehow reminded her of Amelia, her daughter lost so many years ago. Grace stood up and walked to the window. The rain hadn't stopped. It tapped gently against the glass. She hugged her arms tightly and tried to breathe deeply. This wasn't the time to lose focus. She had a job to do, and these thoughts were only going to make things harder. Still, she couldn't deny the feeling inside her. Something about this house, this family, and now this girl was pulling her backward into the past. After finishing her tasks, Grace returned to her room, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Ethan, the drawing, the words, and the photo. She remembered the fire clearly. She remembered losing everything. For years, she believed her daughter had died that night. There was no body, no answers, just ashes. But now, she was beginning to doubt everything again. The idea that her daughter might still be alive had once been too painful to carry. Now it had returned, uninvited, heavy with hope and fear. She didn't know what to believe. She couldn't ask Richard about Sophie, not yet. She didn't want to create problems or raise suspicions. For now, she had to stay quiet. She had to think, observe, and be sure. But one thing was clear. Her life had changed again in one afternoon. And it all started with a simple drawing, a few chalk lines on the floor, and a child's voice saying words that felt like they had come from long ago. A few days later, Grace was cleaning the main living room. It was a quiet morning, and she was alone, dusting the furniture and arranging a few things that had been left out of place. She moved carefully around the large space, always making sure not to disturb anything that looked important. Ethan was playing nearby, sitting on the carpet with some of his small blocks and colored pencils. He was calm, focused on stacking the blocks one over another. Grace had gotten used to his silent company. She didn't need to talk to him all the time. Just being near him was enough. As she moved a heavy vase to clean under it, Ethan suddenly looked up. His eyes followed something on the floor. He stood up, walked over, and pointed to a frame that had fallen behind the vase. "Gray," he said softly, calling her by the name he used. "Look." Grace knelt down and pulled the frame out carefully. It was covered in dust, but the photo inside was still clear. When she wiped the glass, she froze. The photo showed the same girl she had seen in the album from Richard's office, the one with the pink ribbon in her hair and the gentle smile. The child's expression was calm and innocent, her eyes full of light. Grace stared at the picture for a long time, unable to move or speak. She recognized every detail: the small dimple near the left corner of the girl's mouth, the shape of her eyebrows, even the way her hair curled over her forehead. It was like looking directly at a ghost from her own past. Before she could say anything, Ethan stepped closer. "She's alive," he said in a quiet but firm voice. Grace turned to him, her throat tightening. He pointed at the photo again. "She's my sister." Grace's hands began to tremble, her eyes filled with tears. The world around her seemed to stop. She couldn't breathe for a moment, as if all the air in the room had disappeared. Ethan didn't understand the effect his words were having. He kept talking in his slow, careful tone, his eyes fixed on the picture. "Mommy said she came from the fire," he said. "She was a miracle." Grace dropped the cloth she had been holding. The sentence hit her like a punch to the chest. The words repeated in her mind again and again. She came from the fire. It was the same phrase Ethan had used before, when drawing the woman with a baby. She stared at the photo again, tears running down her face. The child looked so much like Amelia that Grace couldn't deny it anymore. The same eyes, the same skin tone, the same look of calmness she remembered from her baby. Her heart began to pound in her chest, louder and louder, as she felt her body go weak. She crouched down, unable to stand, still holding the photo frame tightly. She wanted to speak, but couldn't form any words. All she could do was cry, silently. Her hands shook as she touched the glass, tracing the outline of the little girl's face. For years, she had tried to bury her hope, forcing herself to accept that Amelia was gone. Now, that hope was breaking free again, stronger than ever. Ethan stood quietly beside her, holding onto her arm. He didn't understand why she was crying so much, but he stayed close, watching her with concern. Grace looked at him through her tears and whispered, "Where did you hear that, Ethan?" "Who told you she came from the fire?" Ethan looked confused for a moment, then said softly, "Mommy said it when I was little. She said my sister came from the fire, but she was okay. Daddy doesn't talk about it." Grace felt her stomach twist. The words made no sense, and yet explained everything. Margaret had known something. Richard had kept something hidden. The truth was right there, locked behind years of silence. Grace fell to her knees completely now, unable to hold herself upright. She pressed the frame against her chest and cried uncontrollably. Her sobs filled the empty room, echoing against the walls. All the pain she had buried came rushing back, the night of the fire, the smell of smoke, the sound of crackling wood, and the feeling of losing her daughter in her arms. She had lived with that emptiness for so long that she had almost forgotten what hope felt like. But now, staring at the photo, she felt something powerful awaken inside her. It wasn't just hope, it was certainty. She didn't know how it was possible, but she believed with every part of her that the girl in the photo was Amelia. Her Amelia, her baby who had disappeared in the flames so many years ago. Grace held the frame even tighter, her tears soaking her uniform. Ethan stood silently beside her, watching, his small hands clutching his toy as if sensing something important was happening. For a long time, Grace stayed there, on the floor, crying. She didn't care if someone saw her or asked questions. The truth was too strong to ignore. Everything suddenly made sense. The feeling she had when she saw Sophie's face in the album, the strange connection she felt in that house, the things Ethan said without realizing their meaning. The pieces of her past were finally falling into place. She looked at the photo one more time, her vision blurred by tears. The little girl in the picture, with the pink ribbon and soft eyes, was not just Sophie. She was Amelia, the daughter Grace had lost in the fire 20 years ago. Ethan's innocent words had opened a door she thought was forever closed. "She's alive," Grace whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "My baby is alive." The words came out between sobs, but they felt real. For the first time in decades, Grace believed it. Deep inside her, something broken began to heal. The next day, Grace woke up early with a heavy mind. Everything she had seen and heard was still running through her thoughts. Ethan's words, the photo of the girl, and the strange connection to the past were now too strong to ignore. She couldn't just sit and do nothing. She needed answers. That morning she returned to work as usual, pretending everything was normal. But inside, she had made a decision. She was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. As soon as she had a chance, she began searching the house for anything that could give her more information. She moved quietly, careful not to be seen. In one of the back storage rooms, she found a dusty filing cabinet filled with old documents. She opened drawer after drawer, flipping through folders with dates, receipts, and letters. After a while, she found something, a copy of Sophie's adoption paperwork. The name of the agency caught her attention right away: Bright Horizons. It sounded familiar, but she couldn't remember why. Later that afternoon, during her lunch break, Grace sat alone in a small side garden near the kitchen. One of the older workers, a woman named Teresa, who had been in the house for over 15 years, passed by and greeted her. Grace saw a chance. She asked quietly if Teresa remembered anything about Sophie's adoption. At first, Teresa hesitated, but then she looked around to make sure no one was listening. She said Sophie had come to the family very suddenly, and no one knew much about her background. She remembered Margaret returning from the agency with the child, saying only that it had all happened fast. Grace asked if Teresa remembered the agency's name. Bright Horizons, she said, but that place was shut down years ago. I heard things, not good things. Grace felt a chill. She thanked Teresa and pretended to finish her break calmly, but now she knew she had to dig deeper. The name of the agency was no coincidence. She was sure of it. Back inside, Grace returned to the documents. She found an old envelope with the agency's logo and some contact details, but the address had been crossed out with red ink. She took photos of everything with her phone when no one was watching. Then, without telling anyone, she looked up Bright Horizons online. Her hands shook as she read old news articles about the agency. It had been shut down nearly 15 years ago, investigated for child trafficking, illegal adoptions, and missing records. Many children placed by the agency had unclear histories, and some parents had even discovered that the children they adopted had been taken illegally from birth families. Grace felt sick. Her heart pounded in her chest. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Sophie wasn't just a child who happened to be adopted the same year Amelia disappeared. She had likely been stolen and given to another family under false records. Grace knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She had to talk to Richard. She waited until late in the day when Richard was home. She approached the office, her voice shaking but steady enough to speak. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Richard looked up, distracted, and motioned for her to go ahead. Grace explained that she had seen the photo, that Ethan had said strange things, and that she had discovered Sophie's adoption was through Bright Horizons. She told him everything calmly, hoping he would understand. But before Richard could respond, Mrs. Cole appeared at the doorway. She had overheard everything. "She's been digging into your private files," she said quickly. "I caught her snooping. She's going through your family's personal things." Richard stood up sharply. His expression changed. "What is this?" he asked. "Are you serious?" Grace tried to explain, but he cut her off. "This is insane. Some fantasy from a desperate woman looking for attention." His voice was angry. "You're suspended. Get out of my house." Grace left without another word, holding back her tears. That night, Grace sat alone in her small apartment. Her things were still in her bag, and she hadn't even changed clothes. She stared at the wall, feeling everything collapse around her. The man she trusted had thrown her out. Her job was gone. And yet, she knew she was right. The truth was clear in her heart. She thought of Amelia, of the fire, of all the years of silence and pain. Then she thought of Ethan's face, of the drawing, of the words he said without even knowing their meaning. She cried for a long time, letting the pain out of her body. But after the tears, something else grew stronger: determination. Grace wasn't going to let this go. She had come too far. The truth was in front of her, and now it was her responsibility to prove it. She stood up, wiped her face, and picked up her phone. There was still one thing she could do that didn't need anyone's permission. She was going to get a DNA test. The next morning, Grace got dressed and took the bus into the city. She had found a private lab online that offered confidential DNA tests. She didn't want anyone to know, especially not the Andersons. At the clinic, she explained her situation briefly to the technician and gave her own DNA sample. She also gave them a toothbrush she had taken from the house earlier, a toothbrush used by Ethan, who, as Sophie's brother, would share enough DNA for a match. The technician didn't ask many questions. They handled it professionally and promised to contact her when the results were ready. Grace walked out of the lab feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. The wait would be hard, but at least now she was doing something real, something that could not be denied or called a fantasy. She took the bus back home, holding her phone tightly. No matter what anyone said, no matter how painful it was, she was ready. The truth was coming. And this time, she would not be silenced. While waiting for the DNA results, Grace tried to stay calm, but the anxiety didn't leave her for a second. Every hour felt longer than the last. She kept checking her phone and going over every memory again and again. She thought about Sophie, the photo, the fire, and the years that had passed. She knew what she felt in her heart, but she also knew that people needed proof to believe. She had already been called crazy once. This time, she wanted to make sure she had facts. Then, 2 days after she gave the sample, she received a call from Mrs. Cole asking her to return to the mansion. The message was short and cold. It was about her formal termination and signing the last documents. Grace agreed, knowing she needed to go back. She felt nervous but steady. It wasn't just about a job anymore. Something deeper was happening. That house still held pieces of her story, and she couldn't let it all end with silence and shame. When Grace arrived at the mansion, she walked through the front gate with slow steps. She hadn't seen the house since being suspended, and being back brought a wave of emotions. As she stepped inside, she noticed Ethan standing near the staircase. The moment he saw her, his expression changed. His eyes widened, and without hesitation he ran toward her and hugged her tightly around the waist. Grace froze in place, surprised by how strong the hug was. Ethan looked up at her and said, with a clear and steady voice, "You didn't lie, Gray." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. She bent down, holding him back. It wasn't just the hug that moved her, it was the sentence. Ethan had never spoken like that before. Full sentences were rare for him. She looked up and saw Richard standing at the top of the stairs, watching everything. His face showed confusion and discomfort. He looked shaken, like he didn't know what to say. Grace stood up slowly, wiping her eyes, and gently let go of Ethan. She turned toward Richard and nodded politely. "I came to finish the paperwork," she said. He didn't reply at first, still staring at his son. Then he muttered something about waiting in the office. Grace followed Mrs. Cole to a small meeting room near the back of the house. Papers were already laid out on the table. Everything was simple: termination form, signature lines, and final pay. Grace signed what she had to sign, keeping her tone respectful. She didn't argue, didn't cry, and didn't accuse anyone. When she was done, she asked to say goodbye to Ethan. Mrs. Cole hesitated, but finally agreed. Grace walked to the living room, where Ethan sat on the couch, holding the same colored cloth she once gave him. She knelt down and kissed the top of his head. "Be good, Ethan," she whispered. "You're stronger than anyone knows." He didn't say anything this time, but he nodded slowly. With that, Grace stood up and walked out the front door. She didn't look back. 3 days later, the envelope arrived at her apartment. It was plain, sealed, and marked with the lab's logo. Grace sat at the small kitchen table, staring at it for a long time before opening it. Her hands trembled as she tore the seal. She unfolded the paper slowly, reading each word carefully. The result was clear. There was a confirmed genetic match between her and Sophie Anderson. The percentage was high. There was no mistake. Grace dropped the paper on the table and covered her mouth with her hands. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't broken or desperate. She was a mother, and her daughter was alive. She sat there, letting the weight of the truth wash over her. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't only from pain, they were from something more powerful: certainty. All the years of wondering, of suffering had led to this moment. The little girl she lost in a fire had survived, had grown up, and was living a new life under a different name. Grace finally had proof. That evening, Grace made a decision. She would return to the mansion one last time. Not to argue, not to fight, but to speak the truth. She knew she wasn't walking into a friendly place, but she didn't care. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had lived in fear for too long. Fear of being wrong, fear of being dismissed, fear of being seen as unstable. But now, the truth was on her side. She prepared the documents, placed the DNA result in a folder, and made copies just in case. She didn't want revenge. That was never her goal. She just wanted justice. She wanted Richard to know. She wanted Sophie to have the right to know who she was and where she came from. Grace understood that nothing would undo the past. But the truth had been buried long enough. That house had taken everything from her once. Now she was ready to face it again, not as a lost woman, but as a mother who had finally found her answer. As she stood outside the mansion the next morning, folder in hand, she felt calm. Her heart was beating fast, but her steps were steady. She looked up at the house that had once hired her as a simple cleaner, never knowing she was walking into her own history. She rang the bell and waited. No matter how they responded, no matter what they said, she was ready. Inside that folder was the truth. Inside her heart was the strength she had built over years of pain. She didn't want to cause a scandal or destroy lives, but she would no longer stay quiet. This was not just her story, it was also Sophie's. The girl who had been taken from a fire and raised in a lie deserved to know who she really was. Grace whispered to herself, "This ends today." She knew that when she stepped inside, everything would change. The fire that had once taken everything from her would, at last, bring the truth to light. Grace walked into the mansion, holding the folder tightly in her hands. Her fingers gripped the edges, and her heart was beating fast, but her steps were firm. She had waited long enough for this moment. Inside the folder was the DNA result, clear and official. No opinions, no assumptions, just the truth. She walked through the familiar hallway and made her way to the office where Richard was meeting with the family's lawyer and Mrs. Cole. The door was open. They all looked up when she entered. No one said a word at first. The room went silent. Grace took a deep breath, walked to the table and placed the envelope in the center. Her voice didn't shake when she said, "Sophie is my daughter." Richard's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. The lawyer looked at her, then at the envelope. "Mrs." Cole immediately stood from her seat, ready to speak, but the lawyer raised his hand and opened the envelope first. He pulled out the document and began reading it carefully, line by line. The room remained quiet as the lawyer examined the report. After a few moments, he looked up and spoke with a serious tone. "There's a 99.9% genetic match between Grace Thompson and Sophie Anderson." Richard's face went pale. He sat back in his chair as if the air had been knocked out of him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His hands were shaking. Mrs. Cole was the first to react. "This is a mistake," she said quickly, her voice full of panic. "She's trying to take advantage of your kindness, Richard. This woman has been unstable from the beginning." But before anyone could respond, there was the sound of footsteps running in the hallway. Ethan rushed into the room out of breath, his face red from excitement. "I said it," he yelled. "She's alive." "I told you." He ran straight to Grace and hugged her tightly around the waist, pressing his face against her. Grace fell to her knees, overwhelmed, and started crying. The sight of Ethan hugging Grace broke whatever silence was left in the room. Richard looked at them, still trying to process everything. His eyes stayed locked on the DNA report, then shifted slowly to Grace, and finally to Ethan. His son, who rarely spoke in full sentences, had just expressed something so clear and emotional. Richard's voice came out soft at first. "My wife, Margaret, she always had doubts." His voice cracked. "She said something didn't feel right when we brought Sophie home, but the agency had perfect documents, birth records, medical files. Everything looked real." He lowered his head and took a deep breath. "She brought it up a few times, but we wanted to believe we were doing something good." His hands covered his face for a moment. Then, for the first time, Richard Anderson, the powerful businessman who had always been in control, began to cry. The room was still, the only sound being his soft sobs and Grace's steady tears as she held Ethan close. Grace didn't speak at first. She stayed on the floor, holding Ethan, her tears falling freely. She had waited so many years for this moment. Not revenge, not anger, just recognition. The pain of losing her daughter, the fire, the silence, all of it had led to this. She looked up at Richard through blurry eyes. "I never stopped thinking about her," she said. "Every day. I thought I was crazy for hoping she was alive. But I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right." Richard wiped his face and looked at her with guilt. "I didn't know. I swear to you. If I had known..." His voice trailed off, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Cole stayed quiet now, her face pale. The lawyer slowly stood up and left the room, sensing that this was not a legal conversation anymore. Grace placed her hand on Ethan's back and slowly stood up. Richard stood too. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other, saying nothing. There were no easy words. Then Richard took a step forward and spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry for everything. For what you went through. For what was taken from you. I didn't know. But that doesn't change the pain you've lived with." His voice cracked again, but he kept going. "I can't fix the past. But you deserve the truth. And Sophie, she deserves to know who you are." Grace nodded slowly, tears still running down her cheeks. The moment was heavy, but real. Two broken people, standing in the same room, finally facing what had been hidden for so long. The truth didn't bring back the lost years. It didn't erase the fire or the suffering, but it was a beginning, a place to start again. Ethan stayed close to Grace, still holding her hand. His presence brought calm into the room. His simple belief, his words, had helped make all of this happen. Sometimes the smallest voice could be the loudest. The silence that once filled that house had finally been broken. The room stayed quiet for several more minutes. No one moved, no one rushed. It wasn't the kind of situation that needed quick answers. Grace finally looked at the table where the DNA result still sat. She picked it up and handed it to Richard. "Keep it," she said softly. "It's part of her story now. Yours too." Richard took the paper with both hands, nodding slowly. Grace turned to Ethan and smiled gently. "You helped me, Ethan," she said. "You helped me find something I lost a long time ago." Ethan smiled back, a soft, small smile, but it was enough. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Grace walked toward the door but turned back one last time. "She's not just your daughter," she said. "She's mine too." Richard nodded again, this time without hesitation. "I know," he replied. As Grace walked out, there was no shouting, no arguments. Only the sound of hearts breaking and beginning to heal. The silence, once heavy and cold, now carried truth, and that changed everything. Richard managed to get in touch with Sophie, now 24 years old. He waited for the right moment and chose his words carefully. Over a long phone call, he told her everything. He explained about Grace, the DNA test, and how the truth about her past had come to light after so many years. Sophie didn't say much during the call. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. But as Richard spoke, her silence grew heavier. He told her about the fire, the old agency, and the photo that matched her childhood necklace. She listened, overwhelmed and unsure of what to believe. When the call ended, she sat alone in her apartment, thinking for hours. A few days later, she packed a small bag and flew home. She hadn't been to the mansion in a long time, and walking through the gates again made her feel anxious. Her heart was racing. She wasn't sure what to expect. But she needed to see it for herself. She needed answers, face to face. When Sophie stepped into the house, the atmosphere was thick with emotion. Richard greeted her at the entrance, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were searching the room until they landed on Grace, who stood quietly near the back of the hallway. There was a pause. Neither of them moved. Sophie stared at Grace, scanning every feature of her face. The curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes, the lines that time had drawn on her skin. Something felt familiar, not like a memory, but like a reflection she didn't know she was missing. Grace stood still, holding something in her hand. Slowly, she stepped forward and said softly, "I don't expect you to believe anything right away. But this was you." She held out an old photograph. It was faded, worn from years of being carried and touched. In it, baby Amelia smiled while wearing a small necklace with a silver charm. Sophie looked down at her own neck and reached up to touch the same necklace she'd worn her entire life. The moment she saw the photo, her hands began to tremble. She took the picture, staring at it closely. The baby in the photo had the same eyes, the same necklace. There was no doubt. Her fingers loosened, and the necklace slipped from her hand, falling to the floor. Her eyes filled with tears, and her breathing became shaky. She looked up at Grace again, this time with wide eyes, filled with shock and pain. Grace stepped closer and whispered, "Your name was Amelia." Sophie didn't speak. She just reached out, and Grace met her halfway. They hugged tightly, both of them crying hard, unable to hold it back. It wasn't a polite or quiet hug. It was raw, desperate, filled with years of unanswered questions and lost time. Grace held her daughter like she never wanted to let go again. Sophie sobbed against her, clinging to the woman who had been a stranger just moments before. In that embrace, something broken between them started to heal. Ethan was nearby, standing close to the wall with his hands in his pockets. He watched the scene with a gentle smile on his face. He didn't need to understand all the details. He had already known in his own way that Grace was important, that she belonged with them. As he watched the hug, he softly repeated a single word under his breath, over and over again. Family. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. For Ethan, this moment was something real and right. The people in front of him, the ones who had been apart for so long, were finally together. No more secrets, no more confusion, just connection. Richard stood behind him, silent, watching everything unfold. His eyes were filled with tears. He wasn't the kind of man who cried easily, but today was different. There was nothing to hide behind anymore. No papers, no titles, no wealth, just the raw truth of a family torn apart and slowly coming back together. Richard stepped forward and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. He didn't interrupt the reunion between Grace and Sophie. He just stood quietly, observing, thinking about everything that had happened. He had built businesses, won awards, and managed great challenges. But none of those things compared to this moment. For years, he had raised Sophie as his daughter. He had loved her, protected her, and given her everything he could. But now he realized that love was something deeper than ownership or control. Sophie was never his to keep. She was someone's child, someone's loss, and now someone's found joy. He saw the way she held on to Grace, and he knew this moment was bigger than him. He had always believed that money could solve most problems, that effort and planning could fix almost anything. But today, watching Grace and Sophie cry in each other's arms, he understood something new. There are things in life that only love and truth can reach. Grace and Sophie finally pulled back slightly from the hug, wiping their tears. They looked at each other again, still not fully able to believe what had just happened. Sophie spoke quietly, her voice shaking. "All my life I felt like something was missing. I didn't know what it was. Now I do." Grace smiled, her eyes still red, and nodded. "We have so much time to catch up," she said. "But just being here now, it means everything." Sophie nodded too, and they hugged again, more gently this time. Richard walked over slowly and placed the necklace back into Sophie's hand. "This always belonged to you," he said. She looked at him and gave a small, grateful smile. Ethan stepped closer and placed his hand in Grace's. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't cold or distant. It was peaceful. Everyone stood there together, not as employer and employee, or strangers from different lives, but as something stronger. A family, broken once by fire, now whole again through truth. Night had fallen over the mansion. The hallways were quiet, and all the lights were dimmed, except for the warm glow coming from the living room lamp. Everyone else had already gone to bed, but Grace stayed awake, sitting on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders. In her hands, she held the old photo of Sophie as a child, the one with the pink ribbon and the soft smile. She looked at it for a long time, gently tracing the outline of her daughter's face with her fingers. It was hard to believe everything that had happened. After so many years of loss, pain, and unanswered questions, she was here, in the same house as her daughter. She wasn't dreaming. This was real. She remembered the night of the fire clearly, how everything had fallen apart. And now, in the silence of the house, the wind outside made the same soft noises that had once filled her ears on that terrible night. But this time, the silence didn't bring fear. It brought comfort. As Grace continued sitting there, lost in thought, she felt a small presence near her. Ethan walked slowly into the room, rubbing his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just came over and gently rested his head on her lap. Grace looked down and placed her hand softly on his back. He felt safe with her, and she felt something deep for him too. He wasn't her son by blood, but in so many ways, he had helped her find what was missing. They sat like that for a few minutes, not speaking. Grace kept one hand on the photo and the other on Ethan, holding two pieces of her heart in one moment. She remembered how this little boy had been the first to believe her, how he had said things no one else understood, and how his quiet strength had guided her toward the truth. He had never needed explanations. He just felt things. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, thankful that he had walked into her life. A few minutes later, Richard quietly entered the room. He didn't interrupt. He stood by the doorway for a second, watching the scene in front of him. Grace looked up at him, and they exchanged a simple look. No tension, no anger, just understanding. He walked over and sat down in a nearby chair. His voice was soft when he spoke. "I didn't know what love really was before all this," he said. "I thought providing, protecting, and giving everything money could buy was enough, but I was wrong." Grace listened quietly. Richard continued, "You showed me what it means to love without expecting anything in return. You fought for your daughter with nothing but hope. You never gave up." He leaned back slightly and looked down. "Thank you for that, for showing me something I never learned on my own." Grace didn't say much in return. She just nodded slowly. Richard stood up again, gave Ethan a small pat on the back, and walked out of the room without another word. Not long after Richard left, Grace heard the soft sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned her head and saw Sophie walking toward her. Her daughter's hair was down, and she wore a simple sweater and pants. She didn't say anything at first. She walked slowly, as if unsure of what she was going to say. Then when she reached the sofa, she lowered herself to her knees in front of Grace. She looked up, her eyes filled with emotion. "I came home," Sophie whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, but she said it with certainty. Grace felt her throat tighten. The photo in her hand dropped onto the couch, and she reached forward. Sophie leaned into her arms, and they held each other tightly. No more searching, no more questions. This was what they both needed, to feel, not speak. Their hug was long and strong, and the room felt full of something heavy and healing. Grace kissed the top of Sophie's head and kept her close. Her daughter was finally home. The room stayed quiet, but it didn't feel empty. Ethan remained lying across the sofa, his small hand still holding the edge of Grace's sweater. Sophie stayed in her mother's arms, taking in the warmth of something she never knew she needed so badly. No one rushed to say anything else. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already spoken. Grace looked around the room, the soft lights, the framed memories on the walls, and the gentle calm that filled the space. Everything was different now. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the large windows. They looked like small, glowing dots in the distance, scattered across the night. Grace stared at them, thinking how strange it was that they reminded her of fire, not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that stayed. A warm, glowing fire that kept burning through darkness. Not painful anymore, but alive. A fire that led her here after everything. A fire that never went out. Grace leaned back on the couch, still holding Sophie, who had now fallen half asleep in her arms. Ethan had closed his eyes too, peaceful and safe. The house was still, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Grace looked at the photo again on the couch beside her. It no longer felt like a memory from a lost life. It felt like a bridge between what was and what is. She gently closed her eyes, her arms wrapped around the people who had unknowingly brought her back to life. For the first time in over 20 years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from truth. The kind that rises after years of pain and finally brings rest. Grace didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, she didn't need to worry. The fire that once destroyed her life had now become the light that reunited her family. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.